So I went to the cinema the other day to see the new Pixar film, Elemental, and I had a lot of problems with it. Not only was the writing really poor, and the main characters had absolutely no chemistry, despite the entire film supposedly being a love story, but the racial allegory in the film was fundamentally broken. So before we get into why there is, I should quickly explain what the film's about, in case you haven't seen it. Elemental tells the story of Ember, a character navigating a world where people are composed of different elements. In this universe, Ember's parents, Bernie and Cinder, are fire elementals who discriminate against water elementals and vice versa. Bernie and Cinder hate the water people because they have been discriminated against in the past, even though the first bit of racism we see in the film is their racism. So yeah, it doesn't really work. The motivation behind incorporating racial allegory in Elemental stems from the director, John Son. He had a desire to explore the challenges faced by people who marry outside of their race. You see, in his life, Son faced pressure to marry another Korean person from his family. He said, "I fell in love with someone that wasn't Korean. I grew up in a family where they were like, marry Korean. My grandmother's dying words were, marry Korean. There was a lot of pressure from there, but I fell in love with someone who wasn't." So I understand that this story is very personal for him, but ultimately, he misses the mark massively. Let's talk about how. One of the first examples of racism in Elemental is through the dismissive attitude of Ember's parents, Bernie and Cinder, towards water people. When they arrive in the land, seeking a place to call home, Bernie's frown and dismissive remark about water sets the tone for their prejudice. They immigrate to a new place and immediately, from the offset, are racist. They then have a daughter and pass this racism on to her, as seen by Ember's interaction with water customers at the family shop. We see the tension between different elemental groups. Bernie's instruction for Ember to watch them, and Ember's subsequent outburst directed at the water customers, emphasise this underlying racism. And it's not presented as a bad thing, it's presented as a joke. Like, haha, the funny fire lady is shouting at the water people. It's discrimination and it's handled really poorly. This isn't a light moment. What is truly concerning about the portrayal of racism in Elemental is the lack of condemnation or repercussions for the characters' discrimination. The film fails to address the harm caused by their actions, and instead goes to great lengths to justify and emphasise with these racist characters. This approach unintentionally mirrors the tactics employed by white supremacists, who often seek to justify their racism by presenting themselves as misunderstood or misguided. The character Claude, he's an earth person, and he fancies Ember, but she pushes him aside, saying elementals do not mix, and we are supposed to be fine with that. By downplaying the racist attitudes of Bernie, Cinder, and the other characters, Elemental inadvertently diminishes the seriousness and impact of racism. Racism should be unequivocally condemned, yet the film veers away from holding its characters accountable for this discrimination, for this bad behaviour. This misguided approach undermines the potential power of the film's racial allegory and dilutes its impact as a commentary on real-world racism. There's one scene where Ember and Wade are stood together and Cinder sees her, but she can't see Wade clearly because he's stood behind a water fountain, symbolic for how Cinder is so blinded by her racism that she sees all water people as the same. It's a really damaging viewpoint, and one that we are meant to understand because the film thinks that we should understand it, that we should root for Ember's parents, even to go so far as incorporate the discrimination into the directing of the movie. So why does the racial allegory in Elemental fail? Well, I think it's because at its core, it attempts to draw parallels between the conflicts faced by the Elemental characters and real-world racial tensions. But the decision to depict the characters as distinct elements with inherent incompatibilities weakens it. By emphasizing the stark differences between the elements such as water extinguishing fire or fire burning up the plants, the film inadvertently supports a pro-racism interpretation. It implies that different races cannot coexist harmoniously due to their inherent disparities, which contradicts the intended message of the racial allegory. The film fails to address the complexity and nuances of racial relations, and instead perpetuates the notion that separate races or groups should remain segregated due to their inherent differences. Like I said, this film feels like it's pro-racism, but I know that can't be true. That's what it feels like though. Why make them different elements that obviously do not go together? Surely the reason why racism is so stupid, so wrong, is because it's meaningless. The colour of your skin shouldn't and doesn't matter. It's superficial, but the elements have good reason to not go together. Many attempts at racial allegories tend to fall flat because they make this same mistake. They use vastly different groups as stand-ins for racial dynamics rather than highlighting the similarities. Look at the game Detroit Become Human. The allegory revolves around androids and humans. Two entities that are fundamentally different. The humans have good reason to be scared of the androids because they are more powerful than them, and they could be dangerous if they revolted. Plus, the androids are a creation of humans, so they have sort of a decent reason to want to control something that they have made. The same can't be said with race, because all humans are inherently equal. We all bleed the same blood. And don't get me started on Zootopia, but even that movie did the racial allegory better than Elemental by presenting conflicts between inherently different groups of people and attempting to draw parallels to real-world situations. These narratives inadvertently suggest that races are profoundly different. This is why Elemental feels like it's trying to justify or legitimize racism. I'm going to take a second and step away from how the film deals with racism really poorly, so we can talk about how crappy it was regardless of that. We'll come back to it in a minute, but I need to talk about how crap this film is. From the very start, it becomes evident that the main characters, Ember and Wade, do not have any chemistry. Their connection feels forced and contrived. The writer fails to establish any genuine emotional bond between them. This lack of chemistry between Ember and Wade significantly undermines the film's central love story, making it difficult for viewers to invest in their relationship or feel emotionally invested in the journey. When Ember and Wade first go on a date, it feels unearned, because they don't have any kind of connection. There's no spark there, which is ironic because one of them is literally fire. It's bad writing. Compounding this issue, the film relies heavily on guilt trips and flashbacks to deter Ember from pursuing a relationship with Wade. These narrative devices are employed to heighten the conflict and create tension, but they ultimately feel contrived. Rather than organically exploring the complexities of Ember's struggle, the film resorts to manipulative tactics that do nothing but try and exploit the emotional moments and explain why she is being racist. The poorly written dialogue further exacerbates the problem. At times, characters engage in conflicts without clear justification. I was so confused as to the motivations behind their actions. In one scene, after Ember tells Wade they can't be together just because he's a water person, Wade goes to her and says, "What kind of jerk am I?" To which she replies, "A big one." But he did nothing wrong. It feels out of place and made me feel like I was watching a different film. It's like they wanted it to make some sort of quippy joke here, but it didn't work for the character. It was out of nowhere and unnecessary. I'm genuinely more annoyed at the bad dialogue in this film, more so than I'm annoyed about the failed racial allegory. I think that the biggest thing that this film suffers from is the absence of a compelling antagonist or driving plot behind the romantic storyline. Writers throw romance into stories all the time, sure, that's fine, but relying solely on it leaves the film feeling shallow and one-dimensional. The lack of an external conflict or formidable antagonist means that there is absolutely nothing at stake. The only conflict here is racism. So yeah, this film fails on every level. It fails as a piece of social commentary, it fails to be an entertaining movie, and it failed at the box office. I even went into this film with really low expectations, and yet it still managed to disappoint me. Wherever you do not go and see this film. Go and see Spider-Verse a second time instead. I wish I had. This story is just Romeo and Juliet, but instead of feud and families, it's misguided social commentary about race relations. I reckon this is the worst film of 2023. Right, I'm gonna wrap it up. Sorry if I seem more angry than usual. Subscribe if you can, we're trying to make it to 3k, so help us out with that. Right, I'll let you go.